Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. Today I want to talk about skill checks, I guess I'm going to categorize this under. You know, if you look around the internet, YouTube, blogs, all these different places on Kickstarter, you'll find tons and tons of people's house rules for D&D and other RPGs. You know, looking at the rules and seeing what they feel is missing or needed to add, things they change and modify. And this is not something new. I stumbled upon an article from the very first issue of Dragon magazine in 1976 entitled, hold on, I printed it out so I could look at it here. I wish I had a print copy of Dragon magazine #1. It's called How to Use Non-Prime Requisite Character Attributes by Wesley D. Ives. So I'm not sure if Wesley ended up becoming a regular contributor or did some other things. I'm not a historian by any means, although I am going to talk a little bit about the history of this. And what we've got here is an article where the author is saying, you know, DMs kind of wing stuff, right? Maybe DM fiat is a word we use today a lot, and we need a more codified system, or one would be useful. So they're offering one here to do tasks that are effectively skills, maybe by today's standards, or just out of the ordinary things. Things that we find ourselves, especially playing a lot of old school games, falling into the trap of, okay, just roll a d20 and roll below your ability score. Now, I've never been a huge fan of just doing it that way. The way I typically do that, just as a side note, is I would do a number of d6s. So if it's an easy task, 3d6, harder, 4d6, 5d6, going all the ways up. And I say easy as in like, it's possible. If it's an easy, like, you can just do it, then I don't have people roll at all. Or I might be like, you have a 17 intelligence, you don't need to roll, that kind of thing. But again, that's kind of a fiat, right? Here, they are suggesting a system. So in this video, I'm going to go through their system, which, by the way, when I first looked at it, I think I saw, I'll put a link, The Lonely Adventurer, I believe is the YouTube channel. If it's not, I'll put it on the screen, the name of the channel. And they're doing like a solo using Mythic adventure. And I believe it was there that they kind of referred to this. And I was like, oh, I think I've seen that before. Turns out I had when I started looking at it. But anyways, it's got a lot of math. And immediately I was like, oh boy, this is 1976. But then as I looked at it, I went back and looked at my PDF and I said, this is a really good system. Historical context. All right, let's put this into a somewhat of a historical context. Again, I'm not a historian and I'm just remembering what I think I know. So I might not be exactly right. But in 1976, you have, if they're not out already, every one of the supplements for OD&D is out. Which means that if you think about this article, which we're going to get to, in the terms of Men in Magic, like just the first book, like not Greyhawk and stuff, then you think, well, yeah, it kind of makes sense because while some of the scores do something like dexterity can give you a +1 to hit with missile weapons, most of the ability scores, especially the prime requisite ones, don't really do anything directly in game. It's implied what they might do, help open traps, help negotiate, whatever, but it doesn't actually give you mechanics for most of it. So here we have this. Now, that being said, when we get to the end of 1976, or actually Greyhawk, we do start seeing the ability scores start to become more and more important in a sense, right? Fighters are able to add, they can get the exceptional strength, so like 18 over 50, that kind of stuff, and they're able to add a bonus based on a chart to their hit and damage rolls, and everybody might have a penalty to hit and damage rolls if they have a low strength, but only fighters get the bonus. That's interesting, right? Obviously that changed. Wisdom is still kind of not used for much. Intelligence, it actually talks about like ways you can use it, and a primary way is that magic users now have to roll to see if they can cast or learn certain spells. Again, I'm going off memory here. I think Constitution gets broken down a little bit more too. We can get more hit points. So things are added to the ability scores. So we're starting to see the ability scores become more than just an idea of what your character is. They're more mechanical. So when this comes out, it's not like it's revolutionary to do something else with the ability scores. This is just another way to do it. And of course, the thief is out, and they do mention it in the article. How to use non-prime requisite character attributes. All right, I'm not going to read this whole thing, and you're going to see me looking down because, like I said, I have it printed out. But I'm just going to read little parts of it so you get an idea. Then I'll explain the system, and then I'm going to talk about what I would change, because I think I'm going to actually use this. So here we go. I'm quoting from the article. Whenever a player performs a non-ordinary task or attempts to do so, the referee is usually in a quandary. How to determine fairly whether the character can perform that attempted action. Normally, the referee gives consideration to the player's attributes and then more or less wings it, attempting to be fair, usually giving the player a percentage chance of success. Okay, fair, right? That's what I was talking about before. They're kind of implying here, right? Fiat, which is what we talked about today, right? Oh, you have a high strength, you can do it. A more standardized system is needed, and the following guidelines should help considerably. Okay, so what he's got here is a percent. First, they roll a percentile, and that percentile tells you, and you add to the percentile your ability score. So let's say you've got a 10 intelligence, and you're trying to interpret some writing on a wall, right? That might be something you'd use it for. You're going to roll a percentile and add 10 to it. Then you refer to this, and this is going to tell you, again, there's a lot of math here. This is going to tell you which die to roll. So let's say you rolled a 50. So you add 10 to that, so 60. We look at the chart here, 41 to 60, you're going to roll an 8-sided die. We roll the 8-sided die, we multiply that by our intelligence. So let's say we got 4, we have a 40% chance to interpret it. Simple, right? It's pretty eloquent, and even though there's lots of little math going on here, it kind of feels like it should work. I've seen people talk about multiply the ability score by 5 to get a percentage, right? As a kind of a standardized thing. But this includes this die roll here, which I really like. The thing is, I don't love how it's used. But before we get to that, I just want to talk about more of the article, because here's where I think there's some flaws in the system. So they give an example here. And basically, I'm going to read it. They give the fighters attributes. Grodd's party has been attacked by a pair of bugbears. Grodd wants 3 of his minions to hold off the bugbears while Grodd rolls away the boulder blocking the exit to the dungeon. So will the minions fight? How would you do this? I'm giving you a second. They use charisma here. But there's already a system in the game that does this, right? Loyalty. There's a loyalty score for all of your minions in the game. There's also a morale. So I don't know that I would use this for that. So I will say that this is, I guess, somewhat of a problem with systems. So I'm going to go sideways here. I like this. So I just want to start off by saying that. So Wesley, if you're watching, I'm not trashing your system. But I think we do need to use care when we start adding systems to a game. If you're going to replace the loyalty system, the morale system, all these other things with this, cool. It's your skill system. It's what you're using. In fact, my first thought and why I actually dove into this deeply was I thought to myself, you could almost make a game based entirely around this, which maybe we'll talk about in a future video. Let me know if you're interested in that. I thought it might be good to make kind of an investigative game, but just using this. But I digress. So my warning would be on these kind of things is make sure there's not already something in the system that does this, right? Is there already an actual rule, not the DM makes something up? Now, this gives us an insight, though, into play styles in 76, right? That people were going, oh, okay, what's your strength? All right, 50% chance, right? So I think that, again, what's written in the rules, what people use, how people interpret things is not always how people played, and not everybody knew every rule or used them all the way that they were in the book. So let's take a second here. Loyalty in OD&D is rolled on 3d6, so it's a score just like an ability score. And this loyalty score is exactly perfect for me to use here. So now instead of using charisma, which is what they use in this example, I would have said each of the minions needs to roll their loyalty, right, on this next part, because I feel like that makes the most sense. So again, you can still use this, but I think using the charisma really wasn't the way to handle this. But I digress. I think I've digressed twice so far in this video. Anyways, there's a second part to this, rolling the boulder. Here they use their strength. Now, this again makes a lot of sense and exactly what I think this skill system would be good for. However, this is what I don't love about this system. And if you can have access to Dragon Magazine #1, you'll see whether or not he rolls a boulder. But I don't love that you roll a percentile to determine which die you roll, because now I think you're getting too much into the random zone. I think for a solo game, that's great. And I like the roll of the die, the polyhedral die that is, to multiply your ability, because that gives some flexibility within a task, right? You're not setting a number like saying, okay, this is a difficulty 2, so roll your ability score times 2 is the percentage or whatever, right? You're letting some dice mechanic work here. So what I would modify here, and this is only a small modification when you think about it, is I would, as a GM, decide which die to roll. If the task is incredibly difficult, like rolling a boulder, I might assign a D4 to it. If it's a task that is relatively simple, again, not so simple that you wouldn't have to roll, I might assign a D12 to it. So, and then you can factor in the weird thing like rolling a 1 on a D12 as there was some other obstacle you didn't see. So let's go back to rolling a boulder. If we have a boulder and it's sitting, let's say, at the edge of a cliff and it's just about to fall, there's some small rocks in front of it, and your character has a 10-foot pole or a spear and they can jam it in there and push it over, and it's like literally, if it moves forward half an inch, it'll fall. That's an easy task, right? So you might imagine that scene and go, okay, it's a D12 task, right? Simple. But if they run up there and roll a 1, that means there's some other complication. It's heavier, maybe the spear breaks so they can't get a space to wedge it in. So it's more difficult for them to do. They still might succeed, they're just going to have a lower chance. But let's say you are in a cave full of sand and the boulder's like sitting like kind of sunk into the sand a bit. You've got to roll it like a foot to get it to the edge to get it moving. It's not exactly rounded, right? This might be a D4 task. Like it's going to be difficult to move that boulder. But if you get up there and you roll the 4, so you get basically the best that you could get out of that, you find that indeed, it's more solid than it looked when you rolled up there. So I like that range in between. I really love the roll a die, multiply by your ability score, that's your percent. I love that part of it. I don't love that the die you roll is random. So I did do a little like quick rough math. If you have an average strength, which I did is 10.5 rather, and you roll a 4-sided die, your average is a 26% to achieve it. 6-sided die, 37, 8-sided die, 47, 10-sided die, 53, 12-sided die, 68. So an average person with the 12-sided die has an average of 68% chance. Now, obviously, if you roll a 12 and your strength is 10, that's 120%. You just succeed, right? Easy. So, but you've got this range. It could go as low as, 10 times 1, 10%. But on average, it's 68%. This is good because you can kind of use this as an idea, right? How hard is it for an average person, or what's the chance that an average person should be able to do this task? More often than not, that's a 12-sided, kind of somewhere in the middle, 10 or 8-sided, maybe a third of the time, 6-sided, 25%, right? That's 4-sided. And you can kind of in your head think that out because that'll allow you to know which die to roll. Don't necessarily think about the players, right? The player character, because they might be an 18 strength, right? And then that changes all these numbers. The elephant in the room. All right, so this article goes on to address thieves' skills. And what they basically say is, and they don't just talk about thieves' skills, but they talk about class-specific skills. And what they say here is, basically, if it's something that is a specialized skill, like picking a lock, then you just use your ability score as the percentage. That seems like a pretty simple thing, and I've heard that a bunch of times before, which is probably where I remember reading this article. The rest of it I probably zoomed past. That was the part I remembered. Okay, anybody can pick a lock. If you've got a 9 dexterity, you have a 9% chance. So now you might say, well, what if the thief has 18 dexterity, but their first level pick lock score is 15? Well, then they would have 18, obviously. But they can get better at it. But this also goes into like using magic devices that you're not allowed to use, or spells. And I love this idea of like a fighter picking up a spell scroll and trying to cast it. And what they say here is that if it's the further it is away from your skill set, you start dividing your ability score. So if you have a 10 intelligence, but you're trying to cast a spell and you're a fighter, you might only have a 2% chance, right? Or a 3% chance to cast it. And that's pretty cool because it's incredibly risky. And I just like that. And it goes into this, some other things, using a luck stone or using a blessed spell and this and that. And, again, there's more rules here if you want to read it. But all in all, the system is really neat. Basically, decide. Don't decide on a DC as a fixed number, but as a die. How difficult is this? Is this, for an average person, more often than not, they'll succeed? Assign it a 12-sider. Is this, more often than not, for a average person, they'll fail? Assign it a 4-sider. Somewhere in the middle, again, somewhere in the middle, roll that die, and that's how you get the DC. Now, I would have the player roll it, of course, because that's the way I like to do it, and I've got my cleric. They want to do something that's wisdom-based because, why wouldn't a cleric want to do something that wasn't wisdom-based? And whatever that might be. Actually, let's see what they suggest. All right, so this is the breakdown. I probably should have read this of what they kind of suggest you use different things for, because I did have some comments here too. Strength, any extraordinary physical exertion. Yeah, that's about right. Intelligence, discovering the proper method of operating all mechanical devices, including all magical devices. Discerning patterns, deducing cause and effect, recognizing types of layers, learning a new language and skills, etc. So I don't love discerning patterns. I don't love deducing cause and effect. I feel like that's something the player should be doing. That's the player part of the game. But I do like the idea of learning new languages. That's pretty cool. In my Hyperborea campaign, I wanted the characters to learn languages throughout the game, and most games don't give you that. They have a number of languages that you get when you start, like most of these old school games, and that's it. Like you're okay, you know 7 languages, and you get nothing else. I've played other games where you have that potential. I think it's 2nd edition D&D where languages are a non-weapon proficiency, so you can learn them that way. But I like that, intelligence gives you that. Now, operate devices, that's pretty cool too, because if you don't want to go through the whole, all right, well, tell me how you try to make the wand work, you can just have them roll here. And what I would probably do here is ultimately, which is what I do anyways, I would let them figure it out, but if they fail this roll, then I would expend charges, more charges than I would if they succeeded. Wisdom, again, divining the correct path of action, recognizing the function of devices. Divining the correct path, again, that's part of the game. So here we're mechanizing too much, I think. It's more board gamey. But function of devices, yeah. And again, going back to our cleric, they come into an ancient temple of a god that they're not aware of. Maybe you have them roll intelligence to know if they are, they've studied this god and they don't know anything about it. But they go to an area like an altar and they see some various weird devices. Wisdom would allow them to figure out what they do, right? Intelligence would allow them to know how to use them. So it's kind of interesting. Constitution is stamina. That's pretty easy, swimming, etc. Staying awake, I like that, going hungry. Dexterity, manual manipulation of devices, etc. Climbing, tying knots. So again, it gives you some suggestions as to where you can use these. I like it. I know that it's extra math and sometimes people don't like that, and assigning just a DC is simpler, but I like that there's a little bit of crunch here. We've got some variation. You can be surprised as a dungeon master because you could assign it a D4 in difficulty, but if the player rolls a 4 and they've got a 15, now they got a 60% chance of succeeding where the average person would only have 25. So now this, very difficult task is not quite so difficult. I mean, they still got to make it, but they've got a much better chance. So I like that part of it. I would just say that with a system like this, you either want to go full into it and, drop other systems, or make sure that you're just not like overlapping or using systems that exist. So in the loyalty, like I said, that's a 3d6 roll anyway. So I would just use loyalty times the roll we make here, right? So now let's go back to that combat. The DM would look at the situation and go, okay, how have these minions been treated? This is their loyalty, right? So this is all here. How tough are these bugbears? Has anybody else died in this combat so far? Do the player characters at this moment have the heads up? Then I would multiply, then that's how I determine what die, right? Somewhere in the middle, I'd probably make it a D6 or D8 and say, go for it, depending on, probably a D8. If it was in the middle, I guess that would be right. So I'd have D8 roll, and then hopefully Grodd rolls really well, and the minions fight out the bugbears so they can roll that boulder. You can find out what happened in the original. I think it does tell you the result in the article. But check it out. If you have access to Dragon Magazine #1, I got it through a CD collection that had like all the old Dragon magazines, but I believe you can, stumbling across the internet, you'll find a copy of this article, I'm sure. Maybe I'll turn this into something, properly crediting where I got it from, of course, and put it up for free somewhere. And if I do that, I'll put a link in the description, but it won't be this week. So if you're looking at this video in the future, it might be there. Anyways, thanks so much for watching all the ways to the end. Please do like the video if you did, subscribe to the channel, do all the good YouTube stuff, and I'll talk to you soon.